the history of rom-coms. Very few films have been able to make audiences laugh as much as they cry, but with a good rom-com, that's almost a guarantee. There's something about love that we all love, and over the years, the genre has charmed its way into both our hearts and wallets, consistently being one of Hollywood's biggest earners, or at least it used to be. For the last several years, very few rom-coms have managed to accomplish the level of critical and commercial success seen by their predecessors, an issue that could be attributed to the rise of streaming in the 2010s. However, it's starting to look like things might be turning around for the better, with a handful of recent rom-coms actually doing numbers. Today we're going to be taking a look at the history of the rom-com, from the screwball comedies of the 1930s, to the magical musicals of the 1950s, to the genre's heyday in the 2000s, to its eventual decline in the 2010s. We'll be talking about all of the different actors that have been associated with the genre, how rom-coms have reflected our changing attitudes towards love and relationships, and why we continue to gravitate towards them to this day. If you've been watching this channel for a while, then you already know that I'm a sucker for a good rom-com, especially if the female characters are dressed in fantastic outfits. But you know one thing I never understood? How the heck did they afford all of those clothes on a journalist's salary? That's where today's sponsor, ThredUp, comes in. ThredUp is an online consignment store that makes secondhand shopping easy and affordable. As they say, every woman needs a little black dress. So I picked up this Boohoo number off of ThredUp, and it fits like a glove. So if anyone ever asks me to help them make their ex jealous, this is what I'm wearing. I've always been a sucker for polka dots, blame Pretty Woman, so I also got this adorable green halter dress from Donna Rico for $31.20 off of its estimated price of $191. Tell me this isn't the perfect outfit for a meet cute. Everyone knows red is the color of love, so I figured go hard or go home. I got this BCBG Max Azria dress for $46.20 off of its original estimated price of $362, which I paired with these matching BB heels. This by the way mini dress was only $15.57 off of its estimated retail price of $95, and the matching Ann Taylor heels were originally estimated to cost $137, but I got them for only $24.80 on ThredUp. Growing up watching rom-coms, I thought I'd need a ball gown a lot more often, and even though I don't currently have a black tie function on my calendar, I'd hate to not have anything to wear if I ever got invited to one. This gorgeous Nicole Miller dress was only $70.20 compared to its original estimated price of $498, so fingers crossed I get to have my main character moment. If you click on the link in the description, you can also shop my favorites. I picked out a bunch of items from ThredUp that reminded me of some of my favorite rom-com girlies. So whether you're looking for something quirky, sexy, or sweet, I've got you covered. If you want to help out the planet and look great doing it, head on over to ThredUp today and use my code ModernGurlz for an extra 35% off your first order. Now why don't you grab some popcorn and a box of tissues, and let's get back to the video. Long before the invention of celluloid, romantic comedies had appeared in the theater world, as seen with William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, Pierre Beaumarchais' Marriage of Figaro, and Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. By juxtaposing the dramatic nature of love with zany misunderstandings, there was some much-needed levity to what could otherwise be a depressing story. This concept was wholeheartedly embraced by the early film industry in the 1920s, with the over-the-top acting required for the silent film era lending itself to the typical elements of a rom-com, notably the melodrama and humor. Early examples of the romantic comedy from this time period included 1923's Safety Last, 1924's Sherlock Jr., 1925's The Circle, 1927's It, and 1928's The Circus. Even after talkies took the world by storm, Hollywood continued to experiment with the rom-com formula. In 1933, Bombshell, She Done Him Wrong, and Three Cornered Room were all released, pulling the genre in a new and unexpected direction. Referred to as screwball comedies, these films had a greater emphasis on humor than they did romance, and incorporated tropes like enemies to lovers, secret identities, differing social classes, and absurd misunderstandings, all of which have remained staples of the rom-com genre to this day. 1934's It Happened One Night is widely considered to be the catalyst for the genre's permanent place in Hollywood. The film followed a wealthy heiress who runs away from home after her father threatens to annul her marriage, only to cross paths with an unemployed reporter, who promises to help her in return for the exclusive rights to the saucy story. Although they initially butt heads, the two eventually fall in love, but a misunderstanding nearly drives them apart. The lighthearted film struck a chord with Depression-era audiences, as the story at its core was about something everyone could relate to: love. And it would go on to win in all 5 of the major Academy Award categories, an achievement that has only happened twice in the 90 years since. Through the rest of the 1930s and into the early 1950s, dozens of screwball romances were released, including 1935's Hands Across the Table, 1936's My Man Godfrey, 1938's Bringing Up Baby, 1940's His Girl Friday, 1941's Lady Eve, 1952's Monkey Business, and 1954's How to Marry a Millionaire. The popularity of the genre was credited to the difficulties that defined this time period, like the Great Depression and World War II. And romantic comedies were used as an escape, making them a reliable box office draw throughout the era. With many of these films recycling the same storylines, it became common practice for specific celebrities to be cast in these films over and over again, as the studios already had evidence that they were box office draws. They also knew that they were able to pull off the delicate balance between humor and emotion, which was key to a rom-com's success. Cary Grant was the undeniable king of the rom-com, while Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, and Spencer Tracy made appearances in screwball comedies as well. Barbara Stanwyck, Carole Lombard, Claudette Colbert, Jean Harlow, and Katharine Hepburn were also tied to the genre. The popularity of these films made many of these actors household names, and they continued to be associated with rom-coms long after they'd pivoted to other types of roles. This resulted in some of these actors making romantic comebacks later on in their careers, with those films relying on the audience's nostalgia for their prior performances. In the 1950s, traditional rom-coms returned, lacking the slapstick physicality of the screwball style. While they were still lighthearted, it was clear that there was more of an emphasis on romance than comedy. While female leads of the 1930s and 40s were domineering and headstrong, in the 1950s there was a greater focus on their femininity, innocence, and glamour, as seen in 1953's Roman Holiday, 1954's Sabrina, 1955's 7-Year Itch, and 1959's Pillow Talk. Like years past, age and wealth were important factors in these relationship dynamics, although the sort of battle of the sexes element lessened. 2 of the actresses most associated with the genre at the time were Audrey Hepburn and Marilyn Monroe, with Hepburn securing the crown following Monroe's death in 1962. Star power continued to be the rom-com's selling point, with rumors of co-star affairs hitting newspaper headlines and even being used as a form of marketing. At this time, rom-coms were still respected in the industry as they continued to be nominated for, and win, Oscars. Movie musicals had been all the rage since the 1930s, growing more and more extravagant as the years went by, in direct correlation to their profitability. By combining these 2 genres, musicals and rom-coms, Hollywood struck gold. Early on in the days of the rom-com musical, famous duos like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland were paired together, becoming package deals. And many of these films wound up succeeding purely because audiences liked to see them together, a testament to the importance of chemistry. With Hollywood pushing for color films in the 1940s, musicals became a sight to behold, resulting in the creation of hits like 1947's Down to Earth, 1951's An American in Paris, 1952's Singing in the Rain, 1953's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, 1954's White Christmas, 1956's High Society, 1957's Funny Face, 1963's Bye Bye Birdie, 1964's What a Way to Go, and 1969's Hello Dolly. By combining captivating musical numbers, heartwarming love stories, charismatic celebrities, dazzling set designs, and excellent comedic timing, many of these films have continued to influence the genre to this day. The actors who became associated with the romantic comedy musicals of the 1940s and 50s were triple threats: singing, dancing, and acting, although on occasion, some of these skills would be faked on camera. Male actors who dominated romantic musicals at this time included Gene Kelly, Frank Sinatra, Danny Kaye, Bing Crosby, and Fred Astaire, with their female counterparts including Judy Garland, Rita Hayworth, Shirley MacLaine, and Vera Ellen. Prior to the mid-1950s, Rom-coms had focused on the more emotional aspects of a relationship, but for a brief period of time it focused on the physical side of things instead, resulting in the rise of the sex comedy subgenre. These films acknowledged how people of the time period were more open to the idea of sex before marriage, resulting in many films having plot lines that hinged on whether or not the male characters would successfully bed a woman, eventually falling in love during the chase. In the 1960s, Rock Hudson and Elvis Presley became the new kings of the genre, with one dominating the traditional rom-com, while the other reigned supreme over musicals. Rock Hudson became such a staple of rom-coms at this time that for several years in a row he was voted as one of the most popular stars in America. Unbeknownst to the public, Hudson was gay, something I'd actually attribute to his success in the genre, as he had a better understanding of what behaviors and mannerisms the audience would find attractive. Because the rom-coms of this era so heavily relied on attractiveness, actresses weren't able to continue on for nearly as long as their male counterparts. As a result, in the 1960s, a new batch of hot young starlets quickly replaced them, including Anne Margaret, Jane Fonda, Natalie Wood, Goldie Hawn, and Barbra Streisand. In the late 1960s, there was a greater emphasis on realism in the film industry, resulting in the theatricality of movie musicals and the melodrama of the rom-com falling out of favor. Movies that dealt with romance in a lighthearted manner still existed, of course, but they tended to be cynical, with the characters often expressing doubts in the future of the relationship, foregoing the happily ever afters that had been a prerequisite of the rom-com genre. These dark rom-coms included 1967's The Graduate, 1971's Harold and Maude, 1972's Butterflies Are Free, and 1973's The Way We Were. Unlike prior decades, where rom-coms are a form of escapism for the audience, they had now become frank conversations about relationship hardships, something that perhaps mirrored the changing gender dynamics of the era, with women seeing more and more independence. Writer, director, actor, and predator Woody Allen was probably the biggest name in the rom-com genre in the 1970s, releasing Annie Hall in 1977 and Manhattan in 1979. Both films were massively popular, setting the tone for the relationships in subsequent rom-coms. Unlike other films from the time period that depicted New York as a dangerous city filled with crime and nothing else, Allen's films made the city seem magical, solidifying its place as the ultimate romantic destination. Other rom-coms like The 7-Year Itch and Breakfast at Tiffany's were similarly set in New York, but it wasn't until the 1970s that the city became a character itself. And even now, if you want a movie to check all of the rom-com boxes, it needs to take place in New York. In the 1980s, teenagers had more spending power than ever before, and in order to accommodate this newfound audience, Hollywood began making more and more films to cater to them. This eventually resulted in the popularization of the teen film, which writer-director John Hughes became known for, with his films being massive critical and commercial successes. As coming-of-age stories, many of his films featured romantic subplots, but only 1984's 16 Candles, 1986's Pretty in Pink, 1987's Some Kind of Wonderful, and 1989's She's Having a Baby are considered true rom-coms. Molly Ringwald, John Hughes' red-headed muse, was considered the teen queen of the era, and her down-to-earth quality was credited for the success of many of these films. Other teen rom-coms from the time period included 1983's Valley Girl, 1985's Just One of the Guys, 1987's Can't Buy Me Love, and 1989's Say Anything. Many teenagers of the time period found the premise of these films to be relatable, as the romantic relationships were either between two friends who secretly had feelings for one another, or between two teens who existed in vastly different social circles. While teen comedies were one of the biggest genres of the 1980s, that's not to say that adults didn't get their fair share of rom-coms. Some of these films were more slapstick, like 1982's Tootsie, 1987's Overboard and Blind Date, and 1988's Coming to America, but many maintained the sense of realism introduced the prior decade, although they weren't nearly as pessimistic, like 1987's Moonstruck and 1989's Mystic Pizza and When Harry Met Sally. Tying into feminist movements of the time period, which saw women entering the workforce en masse, many romantic comedies of the 1980s involved the workplace, like 1987's Baby Boom and 1988's Working Girl. While these films often fared fairly well commercially, critically they were taken less seriously. This happened to coincide with a rise in female viewership of the genre, with men tending to gravitate towards more serious films instead. Besides men tending to make a point of belittling the things that women enjoy, the rom-coms from this era were often framed from the woman's perspective, meaning she was no longer a simple piece of eye candy. Combined with the oversaturation of the teen rom-com, people began to associate the genre with more juvenile stories, and they were often considered fluff films compared to thrillers or dramas. In the 1990s, rom-coms became even more popular, something often credited to Pretty Woman, which made over $460 million and solidified Julia Roberts as one of the biggest actresses of the decade. She would go on to star in several rom-coms over the course of the 90s, including 1994's I Love Trouble, 1997's My Best Friend's Wedding, and 1999's Notting Hill and Runaway Bride. Meg Ryan similarly starred in a slew of romantic comedies over the course of the 90s, including 1990's Joe vs. the Volcano, which paired her up with Tom Hanks for the first time. Hanks, who had starred in a handful of rom-coms in the 1980s, like 1984's Splash and 1988's Big, had received critical acclaim for his dramatic roles, but returned to the rom-com genre with Ryan in 1993's Sleepless in Seattle and 1998's You've Got Mail. Sleepless in Seattle was inspired by 1957's An Affair to Remember, while You've Got Mail was a remake of 1940's The Shop Around the Corner. As an ode to these films from the golden age of Hollywood, the main appeal of these rom-coms was the chemistry between Ryan and Hanks, and I still watch You've Got Mail at least twice a year. Several other actors rose to prominence in the 1990s because of their association with the rom-com genre, often jumping back and forth between these more lighthearted films and dramatic roles. This included Sandra Bullock, Hugh Grant, Gwyneth Paltrow, Drew Barrymore, and Dermot Mulroney. What was apparent during this time period was how more than the actual script, what made a rom-com stand out from the crowd was its cast. They not only had to have star power, practically oozing charm out of their pores, but they also had to have chemistry. Just as Woody Allen had influenced rom-coms of the 1970s and John Hughes had defined teen comedies of the 1980s, a handful of creatives became the biggest names in romance in the 1990s. This included Nora Ephron, Richard Curtis, and Nancy Meyers. In an ironic twist of fate, several rom-coms inspired by the works of Shakespeare were adapted for contemporary audiences. While changes were made to better suit the times, the heart of the story remained, and it's interesting how such old tropes were still just as popular then as they were hundreds of years prior. It was around this time that we finally got to see some diversity in the rom-com space, both in regard to race and sexual orientation. Films like 1993's The Wedding Banquet, 1995's To Wong Foo, 1997's In and Out, 1998's The Object of My Affection, and 2000's But I'm a Cheerleader not only featured queer characters, but actually had queer relationships at the forefront. Prior to this point, almost any film with a predominantly LGBTQ+ storyline was a total sob fest, but these rom-coms gave their gays a happy ending. Unfortunately, this dwindled in the 2000s, with only 2004's Saving Face and 2005's Imagine Me and You being released over the course of the decade. Starting in the 1990s, it became more common to see rom-coms about Black love, something that had been a rarity up until that point because of the racist rules that had been a part of the film industry since its inception. This trend started off strong in the 90s with 1992's Boomerang, 1996's A Thin Line Between Love and Hate, 1997's Love Jones, 1998's How Stella Got Her Groove Back, and 1999's The Best Man. Then this continued into the 2000s with 2001's Deliver Us from Eva and Two Can Play That Game, 2003's Love Don't Cost a Thing, and 2006's Last Holiday. At the turn of the 21st century, the rom-com genre hit what is often considered its peak. Besides several rom-coms coming out every year, they were also one of Hollywood's most consistent earners, with each movie easily earning more than $100 million. Besides many actors who had gained notoriety in the 1990s continuing to star in rom-coms throughout the 2000s, several other actors also joined the impressive lineup. For men, this included Matthew McConaughey, Patrick Dempsey, Ryan Reynolds, Ben Stiller, Matt Dillon, Mark Ruffalo, Luke and Owen Wilson, John Cusack, and Vince Vaughn. Both Dempsey and Cusack had previously starred in 1980s teen rom-coms, so it was interesting to see them return to the format decades later. Reese Witherspoon, Sarah Jessica Parker, Cameron Diaz, Brittany Murphy, Diane Keaton, Jennifer Garner, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Julia Stiles, and Gabrielle Union starred in several romantic comedies over the course of the 2000s, some being received more positively than others. But it was Jennifer Lopez, Kate Hudson, and Katherine Heigl who were seen as competing for the title of Queen of the Rom-Com. Hudson was effectively a rom-com nepo baby, as her mother, Goldie Hawn, had been a staple of the genre several decades earlier, and her knack for comedy did seem genetic. Because Hollywood had such a huge roster of rom-com actors, they weren't paired up as they had been in the days of Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, or Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks. Instead, they would either stick any two of them together, effectively guaranteeing a hit, as seen with 2001's America's Sweethearts, 2002's 2 Weeks Notice, 2005's Just Like Heaven, 2006's Failure to Launch, and 2008's What Happens in Vegas. Alternatively, they'd pair one with a lesser-known actor, allowing the rom-com veteran to effectively carry them through, like in 2001's Serendipity, 2002's Made in Manhattan, 2007's No Reservations, 2008's Maid of Honor, and 2009's Ugly Truth. Amanda Bynes dominated the teen market, being followed closely behind by Hilary Duff, although the two starred in very different types of rom-coms, with Bynes primarily being cast in films that allowed her to show off her comedic timing and physicality, like 2003's What a Girl Wants, 2005's Love Wrecked, 2006's She's the Man, and 2007's Sydney White. Rom-coms were widely derided as chick flicks by the public, with men often complaining about being forced to watch them by their partners, as if women don't have to sit through terrible action movies or sports games all the time. This negative sentiment towards rom-coms was likely because, as we'd mentioned, since the 1980s the vast majority had been framed from a female perspective. As if looking for a way to make rom-coms manly again, the raunchy rom-com was created. Having some overlap with the sex comedies of the 1960s, these films tended to focus on the physical aspects of a relationship more than the emotional ones. As such, the female love interests were often incredibly one-note, their only traits being how hot and cool they were. In many instances, the male character would either be a total loser or an irredeemable asshole, but they'd still wind up getting the girl anyway. Because while women dream about finding our Prince Charming, men fantasize about doing the bare minimum and being rewarded for it. Films that fell under this raunchy rom-com category included 2007's The Heartbreak Kid, 2008's My Best Friend's Girl, 2009's I Love You Beth Cooper, and 2010's She's Out of My League. Another rom-com subgenre grew popular at the tail end of the 2000s, the hyperlink. Featuring a large ensemble cast, these films would follow multiple characters who were seemingly unrelated, but had unique storylines that eventually led to them connecting in some way. A few rom-coms had previously utilized the technique, like 1992's Single, 1998's Playing by Heart, 1999's 200 Cigarettes, and 2001's Sidewalks of New York. But it wasn't until 2003's Love Actually that it became a phenomenon, with the film being a massive hit worldwide and eventually becoming a Christmas classic. Subsequent hyperlink films included 2009's He's Just Not That Into You, 2010's Valentine's Day, 2011's New Year's Eve, and 2016's Mother's Day. However, with each release, reception to these films got poorer and poorer, largely due to rom-com fatigue as a whole. Because so many rom-coms were released over the course of the 2000s, Hollywood eventually ran out of ideas, and with so many of the same faces appearing over and over again with similar plotlines, by the end of the decade, all of these movies had begun to blur together. Case in point, 2011's Friends with Benefits and No Strings Attached, two different movies that were basically identical, although one of them is definitely better than the other. While some rom-coms of the 2010s attempted to replicate the same formula as the 90s and 2000s, they failed to make an impact, with generic films like 2010's When in Rome, 2011's What's Your Number, and 2012's This Is War receiving overwhelmingly negative reviews. One of the only rom-coms from the 2010s that's near unanimously considered to hold a candle to the classics of prior decades is 2010's Easy A, something largely attributed to the performance of Emma Stone. Some other rom-coms attempted to take on more serious issues than their predecessors, like life crises, mental health issues, divorce, and illness. With 2010's It's Kind of a Funny Story, 2011's Crazy Stupid Love, 2012's Celeste and Jesse Forever, 2014's Laggies, and 2017's The Big Sick being highlights from the era. Whether or not these films were actually any good, it was immediately apparent that rom-coms weren't bringing in as much money as they had in the past, with drama and action movies being all the rage instead. As a result, Hollywood began putting more resources into those genres as opposed to rom-coms, and this lower budget was very obvious. Rom-coms were also receiving far more criticism than ever before, with many beloved stories being retroactively referred to as creepy instead of endearing, which was a PR nightmare for an industry that was simultaneously being accused of racism and sexism. 2018 was a big year for the genre, with Crazy Rich Asians, To All the Boys I've Loved Before, Love, Simon, Set It Up, and The Kissing Booth all being released, effectively beginning the modern-day rom-com renaissance. Crazy Rich Asians was a remarkable success, grossing over $230 million and becoming the highest-grossing rom-com of the 2010s. One of the first rom-com in decades to actually be nominated for a major award, the critical and commercial success of the film was credited to paving the way for other films with Asian-dominant casts. To All the Boys I've Loved Before and The Kissing Booth, both adaptations of book series, were released straight to streaming, where they proceeded to be viewed by millions, prompting Netflix to not only adapt more YA books, but also release dozens of original rom-coms direct to streaming. While the Hallmark and Lifetime channels had made a name for themselves over the years for their cheesy holiday rom-coms, Netflix gave them a run for their money with the Princess Switch and a Christmas Prince franchise, in addition to several other Christmas-themed films. Love, Simon, which followed a closeted gay student, was positively compared to the teen rom-coms of the 1980s upon its release. With LGBTQ+ issues becoming more and more politicized over the course of the 2000s and 2010s, there had been very few rom-coms that had featured those sorts of relationships in recent years. But after Love, Simon, we saw the release of 2020's The Half of It and The Happiest Season, 2022's Crush, Bros, and Fire Island, and 2023's Red, White, and Royal Blue. While I haven't actively enjoyed all of these, progress is progress. If straight people can have dozens of mediocre rom-coms, why can't the gays too? In the hopes of cashing in on audiences' sense of nostalgia, members of rom-com royalty have returned to the genre in recent years, as seen with Reese Witherspoon and Ashton Kutcher in Your Place or Mine, Jennifer Lopez and Owen Wilson in Marry Me, Sandra Bullock and Channing Tatum in The Lost City, Julia Roberts and George Clooney in Ticket to Paradise, Meg Ryan in What Happens Later, and Diane Keaton in Book Club. These films were by no means a failure. In fact, most turned a profit, proving that at some level, just having a charming cast is enough as far as a rom-com is concerned. While I'm a firm believer that rom-coms about older people can still be enjoyed by other age groups, I do wish we still had as great of a roster of young adult actors in the rom-com space. Sure, there's Lucy Hale and Emma Roberts, but their charm doesn't fly off the screen like their predecessors. Zoe Deutsch is probably our best bet, but none of her rom-coms ever made it to the big screen. Noah Centineo had a brief It Boy period, but since the conclusion of the To All the Boys series in 2021, he hasn't really done anything of note. Glenn Powell might actually have a solid chance of becoming the Matthew McConaughey of our time, with the 2023 film Anyone But You becoming a sleeper hit, grossing over $170 million. The film is a classic screwball comedy, which just so happens to be based on Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. But unfortunately, I don't think the chemistry between the two leads is very strong, which is surprising considering how great it was during the press tour. While there have been many rom-com actors who've been able to successfully transition into dramatic roles, there aren't nearly as many dramatic actors who've done the opposite. You can't teach someone to be funny. They either have it or they don't. And it does feel as though some of the actors they're currently trying to push as rom-com stars just don't have that comedic ability. Not to mention, most of them don't have the star power required to make a movie that we've seen 100 times interesting. In all of the best rom-coms, the actors captured your attention the second they show up on screen. You rooted for them, you cried for them. Nowadays you're lucky if they even manage to get a laugh out of you. Movie studios have always been in the business of making money. That's nothing new. But rom-coms are suffering because of it. Even though we've repeatedly put our money where our mouths are and supported the films we actually found interesting, Hollywood continues to make rom-coms that barely show any signs of effort, which is not only disappointing as a fan of the genre, but also incredibly disrespectful. Rom-coms have brought the film industry billions of dollars. Why shouldn't they be treated with the same level of care as any other genre? Is it just because they're made for women? Rom-coms are about love, and love is for everyone. It doesn't matter what age, gender, race, or size you are. Keeping that in mind, shouldn't Hollywood be putting as much time and effort into a rom-com as we put into our actual relationships? What are some of your favorite rom-coms? Thanks again to ThreadUp for sponsoring this video. Make sure to use my code ModernGurlz for 35% off your first order. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!